Welcome to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson, your host. Former University of Kentucky swimmer Riley Gaines was invited to speak at San Francisco State University recently about fairness in women's sports. But instead of the campus providing a conducive climate that upholds free speech for their students to hear differing perspectives, Gaines was shouted down. In fact, she was unfortunately assaulted, chased down the hallway where she had to barricade herself in a room until police could safely escort her out of that room and out of the building. And joining us to talk further about this is Riley Gaines. Riley, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's nice to talk to you again.
Hey, I just want to get this out at the beginning. I want to thank you for being an outspoken advocate for fairness in women's sports. Of course, here in Kentucky, you testified in front of a legislative committee on your experience competing with Leah Thomas, the University of Pennsylvania swimmer, who is male. And you actually tied him. Good for you, by the way, in the 200 freestyle. I apologize, though. I'm sad that it came down to that, where you actually had to compete with a man, but you held your own. And unfortunately, we see where this has gone. I'm curious, before we get into the question of San Francisco State University. The nation has seen, you and what happened with the competition in Leah Thomas. It's seen other competitions that have been unfair and how women there's a reason why there are women's sports. Do you think that the transgender rights movement has overplayed its hand? Are people seeing through this for what it is?
You know, I do. I feel as if, obviously in my perspective, this happened relatively quickly. This whole gender ideology propaganda, this whole movement. I realized I was naive to how it's been happening for a while. But the past 2 years or so, year especially, it's totally taken over to where now these people, they're not fighting for equal rights. They want to take away our rights as women and children specifically. And so I think people are opening their eyes to what this is doing to women and children specifically and how it's harmful. Of course, we can come at this with a place of compassion for everyone. But what's happening right now is we're catering to the minority at the expense of the majority. And I truly am hopeful that more and more people are seeing this daily. They're seeing how the Biden administration is responding to this type of thing. Democrats in general, not one single Democrat in the U.S. House of Representatives last week voted in favor of protecting women and girls in sports. And so I think people who are still relatively sane and possess a sense of common sense, they're understanding what this movement is really about.
Yeah. You'd think that our educational establishments would understand the reason why there are women's sports. We know that men and women are created differently. Men have more muscle mass. They got greater lung capacity. They're generally taller and stronger and more powerful than women. And it's denying science to say that, yeah, men can compete with women, and that's okay. And yet, you went to University of San Francisco State University to share a perspective that essentially just said that, an institution of higher learning. And tell us what happened. Tell us how you're received and tell us what happened. That was just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. So first of all, my message I was communicating, just as you've said it, nothing even opinionated, nothing other than my experience of what actually happened, what we were actually faced with in terms of the unfair competition, in terms of the locker room, in terms of the silencing that we're dealing with from our universities. And so nothing I even went there to talk about was anything other than what really happened. So I wanted to preface by saying that. But I arrived to the university. I was supposed to meet the campus police an hour and a half before the event started, but the police never showed up. So I figured, no big deal. I'm sure they'll come over to the venue and introduce themselves to me, and we can go over kind of an exit strategy if something like what happened were to happen. And so I go over to the venue, and very quickly the room fills up. It fills up with supporters and also some people who were there in opposition, which I thought I knew what I was getting myself into. I knew there would be protests, and in a way that almost excites me, but not because I'm looking for arguments or controversy, but it's a way to get in front of people who don't agree with you, who I thought would be willing to hear my perspective. I was able to deliver the speech. There was some heckling, of course, but it was relatively respectful. There was some engaging. I answered questions after my speech. But during my speech, I could hear protesters from outside the building. I could hear them from the window. And progressively, as the speech went on, those screams and chants, they were getting closer and closer to the door outside the building, or outside the room I was talking in. And at one point, I could hear they were in the hallway. One side of the hallway would yell down, "Trans rights are under attack." The other side would yell back, "What do? We fight back." And this is when I started feeling a little bit unnerved by the situation, a little bit nervous. Of course, I understand the right to protest and the right to organize, and that's totally cool with me. But it was after the speech when the protesters, the people in the room stood up to leave, and the protesters stormed in. They turned the lights off, they flickered the lights, they rushed to the front of the room. It was at this point I was reluctantly looking for an officer. No officer had introduced themselves to me. I didn't know there were police in the room, but an unmarked officer, not in uniform, she had a face mask over her face. She grabs me and she says, "Come with me. I'm an officer," to which I didn't believe her. But I really didn't have another choice. And it was in the traveling from this front room to getting in the hallway to where I was hit, as well as other Turning Point USA individuals were assaulted. We get into the hallway to where we were only met with more protesters. I'm talking hundreds. The stairways were blocked, so we couldn't leave. We were on the 3rd floor. And so that's ultimately when we had to veer off into another classroom building along that same hallway, where I was barricaded in for over 3 hours. I missed my flight home. I could hear what these protesters were yelling the entire 3 hours I was in this room. Violent, vengeful, hateful, awful things. They were yelling at the officers, "You're only protecting that girl because she's white." They were yelling things, "You shouldn't have come here. You knew we were going to do this. Let her out so we can handle her ourselves." Just things indicating and explicitly saying what they wanted to do to me, which is terrifying to think there's a group of people who, if it weren't for the door separating you two, would have, it's no doubt in my mind that they would have seriously hurt me, or if they had it their way, they would have wanted to kill me. That's what they were yelling. That's what they were expressing. All for saying men and women are different and women deserve equal opportunities.
And all on a university campus where we hear this phrase, believe in science, and the science tells us that there is a difference between men and women, and you were simply explaining that. Riley, again, so sorry that you endured this. Has the university explained itself as to why they didn't provide police protection? Isn't it not their obligation to provide safety for speakers that are invited to speak on campus?
The university has done nothing other than double down on applauding their students for how brave they were when they showed up to peacefully protest. They were so proud of their students, because it can be so hard to listen to someone who spreads so much violence, indicating myself. And so the lady who released this statement, she was the vice president of student affairs. Her name is Dr. Jamila Moore. She released this email. It went out to their student body, and someone sent it to me. And so I'm looking at this and I'm like, okay, is she going to condemn, violence against women? No. Okay. Is she going to say we have to uphold the freedom of speech? No. So I look her up on Twitter. I'm like, who is this person? I was curious who Dr. Jamila Moore was to get a little more background information on her. And I click on her profile and she has me blocked. So it's just wild to me that administrations, not only did they allow this to happen, they're celebrating it. Just like you said, this is supposed to be a place of higher education. You're supposed to learn have that tough dialogue. That's how we grow. That's how we unite ultimately. And I think it's so ironic. This is a school that prides themselves on welcoming diversity. Yet I would consider myself someone who was diverse in the environment to which I was at, and I was not welcomed by any means. So they don't really want diversity. That's not what they're looking for. They want a group of people who believe what they believe so they can continue teaching the narrative that they want to teach.
You had mentioned Jamila Moore, the Vice President for Student Affairs and Enrollment Management at San Francisco State University. And she said this, I'm looking at part of her email right here. It says, and this is an email to the students on campus. She thanked them for being part of the event. And she said, quote, "It took tremendous bravery to stand in a challenging space. I'm proud of the moments where we listened and asked insightful questions. I'm also proud of the moments where our students demonstrated the value of free speech and the right to protest peacefully." Riley, was it a peaceful protest?
If you consider kidnapping peaceful, then maybe, but no, oh my gosh, we must have different definitions of that word. Another piece I forgot to mention of when I was in this room, I could hear the protesters again outside the door, and the dean of students showed up. And the students were negotiating with him money. They said, if she wants to make it home safely, she has to pay us. She's getting paid to be here. Therefore, it's only fair if she wants to make it home, she pays us, which is not true anyways. The university did not pay me to be there. Oh my goodness. But I mean, I was held for ransom, and the dean of students was negotiating with them. And I'm listening to this behind the door. Like, are we really negotiating if I get to go home safe? And that's what they're considering peaceful. This is a crime. This is illegal. So no, by no means was it peaceful.
I had a chance to see that somebody had a cell phone and they were taping that conversation, and it was appalling to see that. I really have a hard time believing that this is where, at least on some university campuses, that this is taking place. Now, Riley, getting back to when you were chased, I understand that you were actually assaulted. You were punched. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're still trying to garner the footage of what that looked like from the CCTV and the body cams. It was incredibly disorienting at the time. But yes, I was jostled by some of the trans rights activists, along with another member of Turning Point who was also a woman. Her name is Amber. She was pushed around and hit in the face. So yeah, there was definitely physical assault that went on.
Are you looking, well, let me, before I ask what you're going to pursue here, have you been interviewed by any Kentucky news outlets, the Lexington Herald Leader or the Louisville Courier Journal? Because when I did a search on this incident, I could not find any Kentucky news outlets that covered this. I had to go to national news outlets, the New York Post. I think CBS covered it. There might have been some coverage in California, but I could find nothing out of Kentucky. Were you interviewed by any Kentucky news outlets?
No, not at all. The only Kentuckians I was interviewed by were Larry Glover, who has a radio show, and Fox, the local station of Fox in Lexington, reached out, but that's it. No Herald, no, none of that. They failed to reach out, which I'm not surprised. When this whole issue blew up a year ago in terms of competing against Leah Thomas, I actually explicitly reached out to Matt Jones to cover it, given his background in sports and how his political sphere as well, hoping he would cover it. And he said, no, I don't want to cover this. This is way too, I don't know where I stand. I think I agree with Leah. I don't want to touch this. So it's really hard to be in a position where the people who are supposed to be reporting these things, supposedly unbiased, aren't even willing to consider the perspective of someone who actually went through this stuff.
Yeah, the reason I ask that is because both of those news outlets that I just mentioned are regularly running stories that talk about anti-trans legislation, opposition to gender-affirming care. Of course, the state legislature passed a bill addressing gender identity issues in public schools, including bathroom bills, what's appropriate to teach in K-5 classrooms, gender preferred pronouns and imposing that on teachers. Many of the mainstream news outlets in Kentucky are carrying this and running with this narrative that it is opposing trans identified kids. It's you are further marginalizing them or hating them, but they're not covering stories like yours. And it's a shame that they didn't do their job as journalists. Last year, when the Fairness in Women's Sports Act came up, Senate Bill 83, which was an issue that Commonwealth Policy Center was very engaged in. And it's a shame now that they're not covering how you were received at a major university campus, especially when it regards free speech rights. This is an issue that I don't care where you are on the spectrum, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, we should all be in favor of free speech and civility. Riley, maybe you need to expand your message and talk about free speech and civility. Have you considered that?
Absolutely. It's something I've definitely now as I travel and I continue talking about it because this is not something that has deterred me in any way. It is something I talk about, which plays in perfectly to the silencing piece that other female athletes are dealing with. It's this big ploy of trying to suppress our voices. Again, if it's something the larger institutions or organizations or radical minority they don't agree with, they will try to do everything in their power to shut you down, even if it means resulting to violence and resulting to physically holding someone against their will. That's what they'll do because they have nothing else on their side, like truth, like common sense, like reason, like logic, like science, to dissuade from my argument.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson here with Riley Gaines, 12-time All-American swimmer on the University of Kentucky women's swim team, and she has become a leading spokesperson, if you will, for fairness in women's sports. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson here with Riley Gaines, and we are talking about fairness in women's sports, and specifically her speech that she gave to San Francisco State University. And Riley, as we were talking before the break, this issue is more than just women's sports, but it's about freedom to share your ideas on a college campus. It's about civility. You were assaulted. You were barricaded in a room for 3 hours where trans activists were in the hallway negotiating your release with university officials. And so Riley, did you ever imagine, I mean, you're a fairly recent graduate from University of Kentucky, but did you imagine yourself in this place a year and a half ago?
Absolutely not. I graduated last year from UK. So in 2022, I thought at this point this year, I'd be in dental school at Kentucky. That's always what I imagined myself doing. Even looking back to when I testified in front of in Kentucky, this was my first state that I testified in front of, which now I've done so many I can't even count. But I look back at my speech, my testimony that I gave, the press conferences that we did, and I almost cringe because I seemed so apologetic. I seemed as if I was apologizing for feeling uncomfortable in the locker room. It seemed as if I was trying to almost allow their narratives that they want you to believe. They want you to think you'll be called all of these names. They want you to think it's wrong to be anything other than inclusive. And I read this and I'm like, wow, I've come so far in terms of being okay with acknowledging how that experience truly affected myself and my teammates and every competitor who was there at that meet. So it's been a year of growth, a year of really learning how to navigate this, learning the best way to communicate this message, learning and hearing from other perspectives that differ from my own so I can strengthen my argument and what that looks like. So in short, no, by no means did I think I would be here, but I understand someone has to be. And so it's been eye-opening for sure.
Yeah. Are you finding other women like yourself coming out of the woodwork, if you will, just standing with you, maybe encouraged to find their voice, just like you've blazed a trail? Are you finding others maybe lining up with you and sharing their voices as well to preserve and to women's sports and for fairness in women's sports?
Yeah, I am. I get a lot of messages privately, whether that be from athletes, whether that be even from a lot of really elite athletes who we all know very well, both male and female, parents, coaches, athletic directors, medical professionals, all who say to me, thank you for doing what you're doing. I stand behind you. A lot of them follow up with continuing to say, I can support you privately, but I can't do it publicly. I'll lose sponsorships, or I work a corporate job. I can't risk losing my job, or different things like that, which of course I can understand. But at the same time, we have to realize how silence is complicity. We need more people who are willing to speak out. Look at what ESPN has done these past few months. I think for a while, they've kind of been on a route to being divisive ultimately, but they've honored Leah Thomas as woman, or for Women's History Month, being this incredibly brave and courageous female swimmer. Where are these women at ESPN? We need them to speak out. And since then, we've had Sage Steele and Sam Ponder, and we have had women who are, but we need more. We need more women with platforms who have influence. We need someone like Venus and Serena Williams who are willing to say, this is just wrong. That's all this is. It's unfair. It's a violation of our privacy. It's a violation of our safety. And it's a violation of Title IX and what it was intended to protect. So there's lots of people. I know the overwhelming majority of the country, especially of athletes, agree with me. It's just a matter of getting them to feel comfortable and confident saying it.
Riley, I agree with you. I think the majority of athletes share our concerns and our perspective. I think the majority of Americans agree with us on this. You look at what Anheuser-Busch did, hiring Dylan Mulvaney as their spokesperson, a transgender individual. Their stock just tanked. They lost $4 billion in just a couple of days. And that was a reaction to their politically correct statement, if you will, their idea of what's right. Well, people vote with their pocketbooks, and we saw backlash against that. I'm wondering what kind of backlash it's going to take to get more people to stand up. And by the way, it's people that are afraid of being canceled. I get that. They're afraid of being targeted or canceled. Maybe they will lose a contract. A star athlete might lose sponsorship here or there. But what I'm thinking of is one of your teammates at Nationals last year who was traumatized when Leah Thomas came in to the women's locker room. You'd shared a story about this woman who was sexually assaulted at one time in her past. All of a sudden, a man shows up in the locker room, no safety there, no concern for women there. And I hate to say this, but is it going to take more of that kind of thing to really galvanize people to say, this is wrong? Men shouldn't be in women's locker rooms. Men shouldn't be competing against women in sports. Is it going to take more of that to galvanize opposition?
Unfortunately, I think it could go two ways. One, yes, it will take more of that. It will take more girls getting hurt. Just this past week, I was in North Carolina testifying, and I was with a girl. I really encouraged her to speak out. I'm sure some of the people listening, have seen the video of this volleyball player from North Carolina who gets a ball spiked in her face, to which she was knocked unconscious by a male athlete, cosplaying as a woman. And so I really encouraged her, she hadn't said anything. And this happened last September. I'm like, come on, talk about this. Be someone who other girls can look to when they're fearful this is happening to them. And so she testified with me, and listening to her testimony. Again, this happened in September. It's obviously now April. She still is dealing with vision problems. She is partially paralyzed on her right side. She cannot retain information, so she has to have special accommodations for testing now at school. She's now not playing collegiate sports anymore. So this injury that was caused by a male playing as a woman has affected her entire life now. And I do think it's going to take more of that before more, in terms of legislature, before more Democrats especially open their eyes to acknowledge how this is harmful, how we're putting women at risk here. So I think that's a way that change will be made. But I think another way change can be made that can avoid all of that. And I know this is easier said than done, but by women not participating in these events, women who, and again, it's easier said than done. I didn't do it when I had the opportunity. I think it was a little newer then, but still, that's no excuse. Standing up on that block, letting the whistle blow, and not jumping in the water. I think some sort of organized boycott, it's been happening in Europe and England, and it's been successful. I think that's a way to show people, to show these large governing bodies that we as women, we're not putting up with this. It's undermining our own physical ceilings and our own uniqueness that the women's sporting category was created to recognize and celebrate and honor. So I think those are two ways changes could be made. One, with avoiding a lot of the really negative side effects.
That's good. Riley, we are running out of time. I want to ask you, though, if you have any advice for parents of public school girls who are concerned about biological boys joining their daughters' sports teams. Do you have any words of wisdom or advice for them?
Absolutely. This goes to both boy moms and girl moms. Do not be afraid to defend your child. Your child needs you. Go to those school board meetings, get involved, know what that process looks like based off of your county or off of your school district. It is so, so important. Don't be afraid to ruffle feathers and step on toes, because that's what your daughters and your sons, that's what they need. I think it's important to teach sons masculinity. There's a lot that I think parents could be doing to uphold and protect women's sports, women's rights, and women's spaces. So.
Very good. Riley Gaines, we so appreciate you standing up for safe spaces for women, segregated spaces, if you will, when there's changing areas, restrooms, fairness in women's sports. You have been a leading voice across the country, and I appreciate you, and I know a lot of our listeners appreciate you as well. Keep up the good work, stay strong, and may God bless you.
Of course. Thank you so much, Richard.
All right. Thank you. Take care, Riley.